When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I had finally found the perfect place to settle down. The streets were quiet, the lawns were manicured, and the houses looked like they had been pulled straight from the pages of a glossy real estate magazine. But beneath the polished image, I quickly learned, lurked a system of rules and restrictions that were tightly controlled by the Homeowners Association. At first, the regulations seemed harmless, minor things about paint colors, lawn heights, and trash can placements. I told myself it was simply a way to keep the neighborhood tidy and uniform. But everything changed the day I brought home my golden retriever puppy. From the moment he padded into the yard, tail wagging and ears perked up, I felt complete. Yet, not long after, a thick envelope landed in my mailbox bearing the HOA's official letterhead. Inside was a notice written with cold, impersonal language that banned dogs within the community. Not just barking dogs or aggressive breeds, any dog, of any size, of any temperament. The justification was vague, citing noise control and community cleanliness. The letter went on to say that residents in violation of the rule could face heavy fines or, in extreme cases, be forced to remove their pets. As I read the words, a storm brewed inside me. How could anyone ban dogs? To me, they were family, loyal, loving, and a source of joy. The thought of giving mine up was unthinkable. The weeks that followed revealed that I wasn't the only one upset. On my morning walks, I noticed subtle signs. People whispering to each other at mailboxes, frustrated glances exchanged over hedges, and hushed complaints about the HOA's absurd decree. A couple of neighbors admitted they had dogs hidden indoors, sneaking them outside only at night. One even confessed to driving their dog to another town just so it could run freely without fear of fines. It was clear the rule wasn't about cleanliness or noise. It was about control. The HOA board members prided themselves on micromanaging every detail of the neighborhood, and dogs were simply their latest target. Their message was loud and clear. Individuality and happiness had no place here if it didn't fit their rigid idea of perfection. As the days passed, my frustration turned into determination. I refused to let a handful of power-hungry board members dictate how I should live in my own home. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about me or my dog. This was about every neighbor who felt silenced, every pet owner who felt forced into hiding, and every ounce of joy the HOA tried to smother under the weight of their rules. Then, one afternoon, as I sat in the yard watching my puppy chase butterflies across the grass, an idea struck me with such clarity that I almost laughed out loud. If the HOA wanted to ban dogs, I would do the opposite. Not only would I keep mine, but I would create a space so extravagant, so undeniably joyful, that the entire neighborhood would rally around it. The seed of rebellion had been planted. I would build a luxury dog park right in my own front lawn. I pictured it vividly, a lush, fenced area with shaded benches, water fountains shaped like bones, obstacle courses, and soft turf perfect for paws. A paradise for dogs and their owners. A safe haven where neighbors could gather, laugh, and bond, right under the HOA's nose. The thought electrified me. Of course, I knew it wouldn't be easy. The HOA would fight back and the board members would surely be outraged. But I also knew that people were hungry for change, tired of being pushed around. This dog park could become more than a rebellion. It could become a statement. The planning began in secret. I sketched layouts late into the night, researched suppliers, and quietly asked neighbors if they would support the idea. The responses were more encouraging than I could have imagined. Many were thrilled, offering to chip in with money, supplies, or labor. It was as though the dog ban had awakened something in everyone. A collective defiance, a shared desire to reclaim happiness from the HOA's grip. Still, there was an undercurrent of fear. Everyone knew the risks: fines, lawsuits, harassment. The HOA board was notorious for making life miserable for anyone who opposed them. But the whispers of rebellion grew louder each day, and I realized I had tapped into something bigger than myself. I didn't just want to resist the rule. I wanted to prove that community spirit was stronger than control, and that joy could bloom even in the most restrictive environments. As I stood in my front yard one evening, measuring the space and imagining where each feature would go, I knew there was no turning back. The HOA might have written their ban in black ink, but I was about to write something far bolder across my lawn. The luxury dog park was no longer just an idea. It was my mission. And when the first shovel hit the dirt, I knew the neighborhood would never be the same again. The first day of construction arrived quietly, almost too quietly. I had arranged for the delivery trucks to come mid-morning, when most board members of the HOA would be at work, and I prepared myself for the inevitable stares that would follow. When the trucks rumbled down the street, their engines echoing between the manicured hedges and spotless driveways, curtains twitched across the neighborhood. Neighbors peeked through blinds, and some ventured onto their porches with coffee mugs in hand, curiosity written across their faces. To them, it probably looked like any other home renovation project. But I knew differently. The delivery men unloaded rolls of artificial turf, wooden planks, and fencing materials, stacking them neatly on my front lawn. So, on after, the landscapers I'd hired arrived, setting to work without hesitation. Within hours, the once plain grass was transformed into a hive of activity. Hammers rang out, saws whined, and shovels pierced the earth. By midday, the first real change appeared, the outline of the fenced enclosure. Posts were planted firmly into the ground, and a skeleton of freedom began to rise. Watching it take shape filled me with both pride and apprehension. Every plank nailed down felt like a direct challenge to the HOA's authority. Every hole dug was another act of defiance. The neighborhood, once silent and orderly, suddenly buzzed with energy. Some neighbors, emboldened by the sight, strolled over under the guise of checking out the project. Their eyes sparkled with unspoken approval. A few even whispered words of encouragement before quickly retreating, careful not to be seen openly supporting me. But not everyone was so discreet. One woman, clutching her small terrier in her arms, stood at the edge of my yard, openly smiling as she watched the work. For the first time in months, she let her dog sniff the fresh air without fear. Another man, walking briskly past, muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "About time someone stood up to them." Yet, as much as there was support, there was also tension. I caught sight of one of the HOA board members, a stiff, gray-haired man with narrowed eyes, pausing his car in front of my house. He didn't roll down the window, didn't speak. He simply sat there for a full minute, staring at the growing structure, before speeding off. It was only a matter of time before the board would react. Despite the looming threat, the progress was intoxicating. By the end of the second day, the fence stood tall, enclosing the entire front yard. Inside, the landscapers laid down the artificial turf, transforming bare soil into a lush green carpet. Benches were anchored at the edges, painted in cheerful colors that contrasted against the HOA's mandated neutral tones. A small splash fountain, shaped like a bone, was installed in the center, gleaming in the sunlight. Children passing by pointed excitedly, tugging at their parents' sleeves, asking if they could play inside. Dogs barked from porches, their tails wagging as they strained against leashes, drawn by the scent of freedom in the air. Every step forward fueled my conviction. This wasn't just a personal project anymore. It had already become a symbol. My lawn, once identical to the dozens around it, now radiated life in a way no HOA regulation could suppress. On the third day, however, the resistance arrived in full force. A neatly dressed woman from the HOA marched up my driveway, clipboard in hand, her expression carved from stone. Though her lips never moved into a smile, her eyes carried the weight of authority and disdain. She circled the fenced enclosure like a vulture, scribbling notes furiously, occasionally muttering words like violation and unapproved structure. I didn't confront her. I simply watched from the porch, arms folded, letting her record every detail she wanted. She eventually snapped a series of photos before storming back to her car, slamming the door so hard it echoed across the cul-de-sac. Within the hour, I found another envelope shoved into my mailbox, this one stamped urgent. Inside, the letter accused me of multiple violations, erecting an unapproved structure, altering the appearance of the property without HOA approval, and, of course, promoting the harboring of pets. It ended with a bolded warning that fines would accrue daily until the structure was removed. Reading it, I felt a chill run through me. This was no idle threat. I had seen what the HOA could do to others, how they had buried neighbors in fines until they were forced to sell, or dragged them through legal battles designed to exhaust every ounce of their willpower. But then I looked out the window at my puppy, who was already bounding happily across the new turf, and I felt the fear melt away. No matter what they threatened, no matter how many envelopes they sent, I couldn't undo what I had started. The foundation was already too strong, the vision too vivid. By the end of the week, the dog park was complete. What stood on my lawn wasn't just a patch of turf and a few benches. It was a masterpiece of defiance. A luxury dog haven gleaming with fountains, shaded by small pergolas, and lined with flowers that spilled color in every direction. It was more beautiful than I had even imagined. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold and crimson, I opened the gate for the first time. One by one, neighbors arrived, tentatively at first, then in a steady stream. Dogs of all sizes rushed inside, chasing balls, splashing in the fountain, weaving between the obstacle courses. Laughter filled the air, a sound the neighborhood had long been starved of. Parents chatted on benches, children played with puppies, and for a few precious hours, it felt like the entire community was alive again. From across the street, though, I could see the silhouettes of board members gathering, their arms folded, their faces dark with disapproval. They stood in a small cluster, whispering, glaring at the scene unfolding before them. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just a fight about dogs. It was a battle for the soul of the neighborhood. And judging by the joy surrounding me, the battle had only just begun. The morning after the dog park's grand opening, I woke to find a thick stack of envelopes crammed into my mailbox. Each bore the HOA's logo, and each was marked "Immediate Action Required." It didn't take long to see what they contained. Fines, notices, and threats, delivered in rapid succession as though sheer paperwork could crush the joy that had blossomed on me. Lawn. The first letter demanded $500 for erecting an unapproved fence. The second charged another $250 for installing unauthorized landscaping features. By the third, the HOA had tacked on daily penalties that would continue to accumulate until the unlawful structure is removed in its entirety. The total, by the time I finished reading, already exceeded $1,000. I sat at my kitchen table, the papers spread out before me like battle maps. To anyone else, the barrage might have been overwhelming, but to me, it only confirmed what I already knew. The HOA wasn't just angry. They were terrified. Terrified that their control was slipping. Terrified that neighbors had found something stronger than their rules: community. That evening, the board called an emergency meeting. Notices were taped to mailboxes and slipped under doors, summoning residents to the clubhouse. The tone was unmistakable. They intended to make an example of me. When the night came, I didn't attend. I didn't need to. The clubhouse windows glowed, and through them, I could see the rigid figures of the board members addressing the crowd. Their arms gestured sharply, their faces flushed with indignation. I could imagine the words spilling from their lips: violation, fines, disorder, unacceptable behavior. But as the hours passed, a shift occurred. Neighbors left the meeting one by one, some shaking their heads, others muttering under their breath. When the last few trickled out, their expressions weren't fearful. They were resolute. By the next morning, whispers spread across the neighborhood. People were tired of being bullied. They were tired of having every detail of their lives scrutinized and penalized. The dog park had given them a taste of freedom, and they weren't willing to let it go. That evening, when I unlocked the gate once more neighbors arrived than ever before. Families who had never spoken to each other gathered under the pergola. Dogs chased each other until they collapsed in happy heaps of fur. The fountain sparkled under the porch lights, and laughter carried into the night. The HOA's letters hadn't weakened the spirit of the neighborhood. They had strengthened it. Every fine they sent only fanned the flames of defiance. But the board didn't stop. Over the following days, the harassment escalated. One morning I found a bright orange notice taped to my front door, declaring that if the illegal structure wasn't removed within 10 days, the HOA would take corrective action themselves and charge me for the cost. Another day, a man in a suit arrived, knocking firmly on my door. He introduced himself as the HOA's attorney, speaking with the kind of rehearsed authority meant to intimidate. He handed me yet another packet of papers, this one threatening formal legal proceedings if I refused to comply. The intimidation didn't end there. A board member parked his car across from my house for hours at a time, glaring at anyone who entered the park. Another began photographing every gathering, snapping pictures of families and pets as though documenting evidence for a crime. And yet, through it all, the park continued to thrive. The more pressure the board applied, the more determined the community became. Neighbors brought over lawn chairs, coolers of drinks, even portable grills for weekend cookouts by the fountain. The dog park wasn't just a park anymore. It had become the heart of the neighborhood. The board's rage grew with each passing day. One afternoon, as I watered the flowers along the fence, I spotted the HOA president herself striding toward my property. Her posture was stiff, her expression sour, as though the very air around my lawn offended her. She stopped at the gate, clutching a folder bulging with papers, and for a long moment simply stared. Behind her, a small group of board members lingered, their arms folded in solidarity. She didn't step inside. Instead, she slipped an envelope through the bars of the gate, turned sharply on her heel, and marched away. Inside was the harshest letter yet, a formal notice of intent to sue, complete with citations of bylaws and demands for immediate compliance. For the first time, doubt flickered inside me. This wasn't just about fines anymore. They were preparing for a full-scale legal battle, a battle that could drain my finances, consume my time, and possibly cost me my home. That night, as I sat alone with the letter in hand, the weight of it pressed hard against my resolve. I thought about the risk, about how much I could lose if I continued down this path. But then I thought about the neighbors who had rallied, the children who played with their dogs without fear, the laughter that had returned to streets that had once been silent. I thought about the way my puppy curled up contentedly on the turf, safe and happy in the home I had promised to protect. And I knew there was no turning back. The HOA had declared war, and if they wanted a fight, I would give them one. What I didn't know, however, was that the next move wouldn't come from me. The next move would come from the community itself. The first sign that the neighborhood was shifting came in the form of a petition. I hadn't organized it, but one morning I found it taped to my front door, covered in signatures. It was simple, handwritten, and direct. We support the dog park. We oppose the HOA's ban on dogs. This community deserves joy, not punishment. By the end of the week, the petition had circulated across the neighborhood. Dozens of names appeared in neat lines, each one representing a household no longer willing to live in silence. Families signed together, Couples scrawled their names side by side. Even elderly residents added shaky signatures at the bottom of the page. The HOA board must have seen it too, because their response was swift and bitter. Letters appeared in mailboxes accusing the petition of being illegitimate. A notice was posted on the community bulletin board declaring that any further defiance would result in escalated fines and potential foreclosures. It was meant to frighten people back into submission. But instead, it did the opposite. On Friday evening, when I opened the park gates, more neighbors arrived than ever before. They didn't just bring their dogs, they brought folding tables laden with snacks, string lights to drape along the fence, and coolers filled with sodas and ice. Music drifted from portable speakers, blending with the sound of barking dogs and laughter. What had begun as a simple dog park was now transforming into a gathering place, a community hub unlike anything the neighborhood had ever known. One by one, residents began telling stories. They spoke of the years of micromanagement, of petty fines for leaving a trash can out an hour too long, of warning letters for planting flowers in unauthorized colors. They spoke of being told what kind of curtains they could hang in their windows, what holiday decorations were acceptable, and how quickly weeds must be removed. The dog park hadn't just broken one rule. It had cracked open years of pent-up frustration. And now that people had a place to speak freely, the truth spilled out. Soon, neighbors began organizing. A small group created a private online page where residents could share updates, vent frustrations, and strategize. Others volunteered to research state housing laws, looking for ways to push back legally against the HOA's overreach. The energy was contagious. Each new post, each late-night message fueled the fire. The board, sensing the groundswell of resistance, escalated its tactics. They sent contractors to inspect homes under flimsy pretenses, hoping to intimidate residents with sudden violations. They increased patrols, driving slowly through the neighborhood with Clip B, boards and cameras, documenting anything that could be written up as a fine. But what they didn't expect was that the community would stop being afraid. When one neighbor received a $200 fine for leaving her garden hose visible, she refused to pay it. Instead, she brought the letter to the park, passing it around for everyone to see. Outrage rippled through the crowd. By the end of the night, several households had vowed to contest their fines as well. The board's power, once absolute, was beginning to crack. And then, something remarkable happened. On a warm Saturday afternoon, dozens of neighbors showed up with supplies. Some brought paint and wood, others brought tools and decorations. Together, they expanded the dog park, building new features that hadn't been part of my original design. A shaded pavilion took shape in one corner. A mural of dogs painted in bright colors appeared on the fence. Someone even donated agility equipment, tunnels, ramps, and hoops that turned the park into a full-fledged playground for pets. The work took hours, but by the time the sun set, the park had been transformed into something extraordinary. It wasn't just my project anymore. It belonged to the entire neighborhood. The board's fury reached its peak that night. They called another emergency meeting, plastering urgent notices across the community. But this time, something was different. Instead of attending, residents gathered at the dog park. One by one, they arrived with lawn chairs, snacks, and dogs in tow. The clubhouse lights glowed in the distance, but it sat nearly empty while the park pulsed with life and laughter. For the first time, the HOA wasn't the center of authority. The park was. I stood at the gate, watching as neighbors who had barely spoken to each other in years now mingled freely, their children playing together under the twinkling string lights. The sound of barking dogs mixed with music and laughter, a chorus of rebellion that no fine or lawsuit could silence. And then, as the night stretched on, someone leaned over and whispered what many had already been thinking. "Why don't we vote them out?" The words sent a ripple through the crowd. For years, the board had operated unchallenged, clinging to power because no one had dared to contest them. But now, with a united community and momentum on their side, the idea no longer seemed impossible. The next morning, the first signs of a recall campaign appeared. Flyers slipped under doors. Conversations at mailboxes turned into strategy sessions. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down were now openly talking about replacing the board. The HOA had tried to crush me with fines and threats. Instead, they had awakened an entire neighborhood. And as the recall effort gained steam, I realized that the fight was no longer about my lawn, or even the dog park itself. It was about who truly owned the community, the board, or the people who called it home. The recall campaign spread faster than anyone could have predicted. What had started as whispers around the dog park soon became the heartbeat of the entire neighborhood. Flyers appeared on doors, emails circulated privately, and neighbors gathered late into the night under the string lights of the park, planning their next steps. Everywhere I looked, there was a sense of momentum. Retirees who had once been silent suddenly became the most vocal, recounting years of unfair treatment. Parents with young children demanded a safer, friendlier community. Even those without dogs began to speak out, recognizing that the HOA's stranglehold affected every resident, pet owner or not. The board, however, was not about to surrender without a fight. Their response was swift, aggressive, and laced with desperation. The fines against me grew by the day. What had once been hundreds of dollars had ballooned into the tens of thousands, the total climbing higher with each new notice shoved into my mailbox. The board issued threats of liens against my property, claiming they had the authority to seize assets if I refused to pay. The language in their letters became harsher, more frantic, as though the paper itself trembled with anger. But I wasn't the only target. Other outspoken neighbors began receiving citations too. Petty, fabricated violations clearly designed to punish anyone supporting the recall. One family was fined for having improperly stored bicycles. Another was accused of excessive foot traffic because their driveway held too many cars during a weekend gathering. The neighborhood, once fearful of such tactics, now treated them with open scorn. Instead of retreating, residents brought their letters to the dog park, waving them like trophies of defiance. Each fine only deepened the community's resolve. The board's presence became more menacing. Members drove slowly past the park at night, headlights lingering on the families gathered inside. The HOA president herself began showing up unannounced, clipboard in hand, scribbling furiously as though documentation alone could halt what was happening. Her sharp heels clicked angrily against the sidewalk, a rhythm of hostility that only made neighbors laugh louder in response. But beneath the laughter, tension grew. Everyone knew the board wouldn't go quietly. They had ruled unchecked for too long, and now, facing rebellion, they would do whatever it took to preserve their grip. The breaking point came one Saturday afternoon. It was one of the largest gatherings the park had seen yet. Nearly the entire neighborhood had come out. Children racing through the agility tunnels, dogs leaping over ramps, parents grilling food beneath the pavilion. Music played, the fountain sparkled, and for a few glorious hours it felt as though the neighborhood had been reborn. Then, without warning, a convoy of cars pulled up. Out stepped the board members dressed in their fest suits, flanked by uniformed security guards they had apparently hired. Their presence silenced the park in an instant. Dogs stopped mid-chase, children froze in place, and adults exchanged uneasy glances. The board president marched forward, her voice carrying across the park with sharp authority. She declared that the dog park was officially closed, that it was an unauthorized structure subject to immediate removal, and that anyone trespassing inside would be fined and potentially prosecuted. Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud. For a moment, fear threatened to return, the kind that had once kept every resident compliant. But then, slowly, something incredible happened. One by one, neighbors stepped forward. Parents stood in front of their children. Dog owners positioned themselves between the board and the gates. Elderly residents, leaning on canes, refused to move from the benches they had claimed as their own. The HOA had arrived expecting submission. Instead, they were met with quiet, immovable resistance. The standoff stretched on, heavy with tension. The security guards shifted uneasily, clearly unprepared for a confrontation with an entire neighborhood. The board president's face twisted with fury, her voice rising as she repeated her threats. But this time, no one listened. Finally, the board retreated, their convoy pulling away under a chorus of cheers from the park. The spell of fear had been broken for good. That night, the recall campaign ignited into full force. Volunteers went door to door, collecting the signatures needed to trigger a vote. By the end of the week, the threshold had been met. A special election was scheduled, one that would decide the future of the neighborhood once and for all. The board, desperate and cornered, began flooding the community with propaganda. Letters warning of chaos without their leadership, flyers predicting financial ruin if the dog park were allowed to remain. Some even accused me of being a dangerous influence, a troublemaker bent on destroying property values. But their words rang hollow. Residents had already seen the truth with their own eyes, children laughing, dogs playing, neighbors finally connecting after years of silence. No letter could erase that. As the day of the election drew near, the tension became palpable. Conversations at the mailbox grew hushed but determined. Every handshake carried the weight of solidarity. The board's shadow still loomed, but the light of rebellion had grown too bright to extinguish. The night before the vote, I stood in the dog park alone, the string lights glowing softly overhead. My puppy rested at my feet, the fountain bubbling quietly nearby. The journey had been exhausting, threats, fines, and endless battles. But as I looked at the park around me, I knew it had all been worth it. Tomorrow would decide everything. Either the board would tighten its grip, or the neighborhood would finally break free. The morning of the election dawned heavy with anticipation. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension as residents emerged from their homes, making their way toward the community clubhouse where the vote would be held. For years, that building had been a place of intimidation. Inside, the board had scolded, fined, and dictated with absolute authority. But today, it would become something different. Today, it would be the site of reckoning. I walked with my neighbors, my puppy trotting happily at my side. Families gathered in clusters along the sidewalks, their conversations hushed but hopeful. The board members stood near the clubhouse doors, stiff-backed and watchful, their faces taut with controlled anger. Their expensive suits and polished shoes contrasted sharply with the easy camaraderie of the residents arriving to vote. The process was simple. Each household cast a ballot either to retain the current board or to recall them in favor of new leadership. But though the mechanics were straightforward, the weight of it was anything but. This was more than a vote. It was a verdict on years of control, pettiness, and fear. Inside the clubhouse, the air was thick and warm. The line moved slowly, each neighbor stepping forward with deliberate care, signing their name and slipping their ballot into the locked box. The board members lingered in the corners, their sharp eyes following every movement, but their presence no longer carried the power it once had. When my turn came, I felt the paper between my fingers, smooth and almost weightless. And yet, as I marked my choice and dropped it into the box, it felt as though I were placing a stone into a foundation, solid, permanent, and unshakable. Hours later, the results were announced on the clubhouse steps. The community gathered, a sea of expectant faces turned toward the board president as she unfolded the paper. Her hands trembled slightly, the crisp sheet shaking as her eyes scanned the tally. Then, with a strained voice, she confirmed what everyone already suspected. The board had been recalled. By a wide margin. The crowd erupted. Cheers, clapping, even tears of relief filled the air. Neighbors hugged, children squealed, dogs barked as if sensing the joy that pulsed through the community. Years of silence and suppression shattered in that single moment, replaced by the sound of victory. The board members stood frozen, their faces pale and unreadable. For the first time they looked small, stripped of their authority, exposed as nothing more than individuals clinging to control that no longer existed. Without a word they turned and left, their footsteps echoing against the pavement as the crowd's cheers grew louder behind them. That evening the celebration moved to the dog park. String lights twinkled like stars overhead, music, filled the air, and the fountain bubbled happily in the center. Neighbors brought food, drinks, and stories to share. It was more than a party. It was a rebirth of the neighborhood itself. Children darted through the agility course, dogs splashed in the fountain, and elderly residents sat beneath the pavilion, smiling at the energy around them. For the first time, the community truly felt like a community, free from the weight of constant surveillance and fear. As the night stretched on, a group of residents approached me. They thanked me, not just for building the park, but for sparking the movement that had brought everyone together. They told me it had been years since they'd felt proud of their neighborhood, years since they'd felt free to enjoy their homes without fear of fines or reprimands. One by one, they promised that the dog park would stay, that it would remain a symbol of what the community had fought for and won. In the weeks that followed, new leadership was elected. Unlike the old board, the new members were residents who had stood shoulder to shoulder in the park during the hardest days. Their first act was to overturn the ban on dogs, declaring openly that pets were family and deserved a place in the community. Their second act was to recognize the dog park officially, ensuring it would remain protected and maintained as a shared space for everyone. The transformation of the neighborhood was remarkable. Where once there had been fear and silence, there was now laughter and conversation. Neighbors waved from porches, gathered for weekend barbecues, and strolled the streets with their dogs without glancing over their shoulders. The air felt lighter, freer, as though the very atmosphere had changed. For me, the victory wasn't about fines avoided or battles won. It was about the joy that returned to the lives around me. I watched my puppy race across the turf, chasing other dogs, his fur glowing under the evening lights. And I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. The HOA had tried to strip us of that joy. They had tried to smother us with rules, threats, and fear. But in the end, they had only united us. The dog park still stood, greener and livelier than ever. A monument not just to rebellion, but to resilience. And every time I watched neighbors gather inside its gates, laughing and smiling as their dogs played freely, I knew one thing for certain. They had tried to ban joy, but joy had won.